Not to look at it. It's just it's like a third degree.
Check itself out.
Yeah.
Is that the best angle for this?
Yeah.
I don't know. You want a better angle?
Yeah, like from our.
Well, it's good for the audience, but it's
I don't need to be on this. Does it need to be plugged in or no?
I kind of like it, but it's
I
up
don't
to
need to
you.
be seen here.
You can put it on.
I have it.
I guess, I don't know. Do you mind if I just put it here? I'll just cut the initial part later.
Make Orwell fiction again?
Yeah.
Explain that one.
Oh, you know 1984?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like,
Dismantle the surveillance state, basically.
Yeah.
okay.
Patriot Act.
Yeah. But you were just like really like the author, like fuck Orwell, but it's okay.
Oh no, not necessarily.
Yeah, that's why I was like, just
Yeah.
wait, what?
He was a little bit. I actually, that's a valid interpretation. I never thought it was that way. We're Orwell truth.
It's a deeper cut conspiracy. I don't think these are.
Yeah, they go, oh yeah, like 1984. He
He
is.
Hey.
He did not exist.
I'm a member of Platypus. But, I mean, I'm interested in libertarianism.
He's special. Yeah, he was.
How about you?
I'm not, as you know, I'm not a member of Platypus.
No, you can't.
I know.
I'm personally not a fan
I have
of
class with
that.
that.
Oh yeah? Contention.
Excited.
Yeah.
I'm actually curious.
Marxism, actually. We're all in Marxism. I'm in Ulysses, and I've actually read Why Not Some, but
Yeah.
I don't know.
Where you all are and
I disagree with a few points. I
among
think
you
it takes. We'll see what happens. I'm on the Platypus network. Like, I've always been interested, but I just never. It's always like something.
Have you ever heard of libertarianism?
No, I don't really know anything about libertarianism. That'll be interesting.
Okay, we should bring in more shares from other classes.
I feel like they're probably hoping that Platypus shares libertarianism focus on
Yeah, table like two there. Put up here.
within libertarianism there's a whole bunch of economic thought.
Yeah.
I'm the confirmation class.
It's interesting stuff.
I don't know where the libertarians are right now.
My dad was
In terms of like the whole.
And people who are interested in it, or like those groupings where they're on the political spectrum.
Yeah, like the political spectrum. Like,
Oh.
I mean, in terms of like the Trump, like where Democrats
Oh,
are,
yeah.
where Republicans are right now.
grandmother in German.
We weren't sure if anyone was using it.
Interested in it.
They were Hey, nice to see you again. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
I might want to move the laptop.
Are you debating?
Do you want to move the laptop?
Oh yeah,
If you have someone sitting here. Okay.
That's the next one. Okay. Sounds good. I'll just put it back to its own original place.
I thought maybe you wanted to create a whole road.
I mean, I guess we can.
It's like if there
More people show up.
10 people, 10 or so people, 10 people, it might be worth it.
Yeah, let's do it.
Maybe we wait until, I don't know. Like it might feel like we might as well do it.
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah, no, I go.
Yeah, I think so.
See what can be accomplished with socialist and libertarian forces.
You guys mind like pushing this row a little back and sitting with you guys so there's like more space in that part? the worst thing that has happened to the country.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's my opinion. I mean, that's the reason why I'm here.
Okay. What do you mean? Like, study in the US, or what do you mean? What's that?
I'm an asylum seeker.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, we're just grabbing all there. You can come British. Yeah, you can carry
I got a question for you. Does it smell up in the front? You got to take 6 feet off, your shoes off. Yeah. That's well, yeah, but no, it's
It doesn't really speak to me that much. It's just part of everyone's journey.
doing the same thing.
It's not required that we need like electives. In the math part, there's like 0 electives. No.
Our beautiful sign is included.
How are people going to know the left is dead?
It's almost like we'll have to convince them.
I did read the about section of your website and I tried to address that slogan in my conclusion statement, so we can have a conversation about that. So for the statements and the responses, we're thinking like maybe trials could go about share for support, 5 minutes, it could be 6 or 7 minutes, and this so that's fine, right? Okay. Yeah.
Busier than I thought.
Yeah, same.
I'm just going to put this. Would it be more helpful if we had it?
It's nice to have a Democrat in the middle of Libertarians. Yeah, exactly.
Don't worry, I'm used to that.
Honestly, I can start, and then you guys can, if you want, obviously, you're okay with that. Sure. Yeah, and then you can answer the first question first, and then we can answer later. Okay. Alright, welcome everyone. This is the very first public political debate between 2 BC clubs.
Maybe the last.
Hopefully not. Hopefully not. Thanks all for coming. I was not expecting this much of a turnout, to be very honest. So I'm kind of nervous, but I'll try my best. So while listening to this debate, I encourage you to be open-minded. Our ideas might sound a little extreme, but we come up with these ideas through like thinking and through reasoning and through. So just try to be open-minded. So so as libertarians, we recognize that neither ideology is monolithic. Libertarians ranges from people who believe that states should be minimal to those who believe the total abolishment of the state. As an anarcho-capitalist myself, I believe that a stateless society is more peaceful, prosperous, and most importantly, ethically just. So this does not necessarily entail that society should be without rules. Rather, anarcho-capitalism is achieved through careful implementation of the non-aggression principle, which is going to be a very core theme in my opening statement. So in this context, aggression means initiation of conflict. While libertarians differ on some details, we all agree that NAP is the ethical and practical foundation of a just society. So now let's address the fundamental political and economic question: how to distribute scarce resources justly. We all know that these resources that are available to us are scarce and not unlimited. So the point is, how do we distribute these resources between 2 conflicting parties? So since all human action requires scarce resources, conflicts inevitably arise, be it disputes over land, inheritance, taxation, regulations, trespass, fraud, or theft. To resolve conflicts over scarce resources, we must look at law, as the law determines how to resolve disputes over scarce resources. A valid law must be objective and universal. This is a very important point, because you can't just have a law that is arbitrarily dictated by an authority. So let's analyze 3 possible legal systems. Number 1, might makes right. In this system, whoever overpowers the other wins the conflict. This is a perversion of law itself, since it rewards conflicts rather than resolving them. Number 2 is class-based law, which is more popular, and Marxism falls into this category. This is any system where different rules apply to different groups, such as race, gender, or economic status. Marxism falls in this category by dividing people into bourgeoisie and proletariat. I don't know if I pronounced that right. Bourgeoisie, right? Okay. So where the proletariat by default wins conflict against the bourgeoisie. This is ethically wrong, because no class distinction justifies unequal treatment under the law. A given conflict has to be resolved with specific evidence regarding the conflict itself. Race, gender, religion, or economic status should not be a matter in conflict resolution. And finally, we have the non-aggression principle, which states that those who aggress, i.e. those who initiate conflict, are the losers of a given conflict. This can be better understood with the following scenario. So imagine Crusoe and Friday are on a desert island, and the island has only one stick. This represents scarcity. So Crusoe finds this stick in nature without initiating any conflict and sharpens the edges of the stick and aims to spearfish with that stick. This example illustrates conflicts over scarce resources, because Friday sees the stick in Crusoe's hand and desires to make a fire with that said stick. So the problem is there are only 2 ways to resolve this conflict: either let Crusoe spearfish or Friday make a fire. Which means that we will either reward either the first comer Crusoe or the late comer Friday. If we embrace the late comer ethic, there is nothing stopping Crusoe or some other party to become late comers themselves, and conflicts will run rampant. Thus, the only way to consistently avoid and resolve conflicts is to reward the first comer, namely the person who did not initiate the conflict. Given that we have derived NAP merely from facts of the given conflict, we can say that it is objective and universal. And if we accept NAP, we can find out that property can only be legitimately acquired in non-aggressive ways. One can either own through homesteading or voluntary exchange. For clarity, homesteading is mixing one's labor with unowned resources, and voluntary exchange is 2 parties exchanging resources without coercion. In this speech and further points of the debate, by ownership and property, I mean having a right to direct something. This entails the right to use it or not use it as you wish. What makes NAP's case even stronger is the fact that laws must be argued for, not merely imposed. Nobody has an innate or divine insight into laws, so we must use reason and argumentation to discover laws. But what is argumentation? Argumentation is a peaceful, truth-seeking interaction. If I tried to slap my opponent until it was conceded that libertarianism is better, that wouldn't be argumentation, that would be aggression. Since argumentation is peaceful, aggression cannot be argued for. Initiation of conflict cannot be argued for. So anyone arguing for aggression would find themselves in a performative contradiction. And performative contradiction is something like, I'm not talking. That's a performative contradiction. You have to talk in order to say I'm not talking, so you'd be wrong. Thus, might makes right fails because it tries to argue for aggression. Class-based laws also fail because they assume certain groups can be aggressed against simply due to their class. On the other hand, NAP agrees with the norms of argumentation because it opposes aggression. Thus, the NAP is self-evident. It is the only law that can be argued for among its alternatives. As the Founding Fathers wrote, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed with unalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. However, they followed it with a mistaken notion that a government is needed to secure these rights. Unfortunately, the state inherently violates the NAP. The founders of social contract theory claim that citizens consent to government authority. But this is false. No one explicitly signs a contract with the government. And the analogies suggesting implied consent are also wrong. And a very common example is, let's say you enter a restaurant and you implicitly consent that you have to pay the bills to the restaurant owner. But in that example, the restaurant owner owns the restaurant. He either homesteaded or engaged in voluntary exchange to acquire that restaurant. But the difference is the state does not own anything. It takes everything by force. So if I were to invade my neighbor's house, I would not become its rightful owner. And if I claimed ownership over the moon and taxed people for walking there, that would also not be legitimate. If the state's origin is built on either invasion or mere claims over territory, any homestead or exchange they engage in after their origin is funded by taxation, which is nothing but extortion. So it becomes clear that social contract theory is no different from the divine right of kings. It is merely a modern excuse to justify government rule, yet no less dogmatic. Other justifications for the state include the state is the people argument and democracy. If people were indeed the state itself, Jews in Nazi Germany, Uyghurs in China, and Japanese Americans under FDR would have sent themselves to concentration camps. The state engages in activities that clearly go against what individuals or groups of people want. As for democracy, it is similar in nature to the state is the people argument, because apparently it represents people's will. On the contrary, it does not represent the people's will, but at best, the will of the majority. And even that is questionable, since election after election, many vote for the lesser evil. In light of these facts, the answer to our fundamental question is obvious. The law says thou shalt not steal and thou shalt not murder, and the state is not above this law. Thank you.
So NAP is non-aggression what?
It's the non-aggression principle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, thank you everyone for being here. Thanks to BC Libertarians for co-hosting this event with us, and Tom for moderating too. I'll say first, so we're here obviously as the Marxists, but we're also Platypus. So I'm gonna do a little blurb about what Platypus is, just to get that out of the way. So the Platypus Affiliated Society, established in December 2006, organizes reading groups, public fora, research and journalism, focused on problems and tasks inherited from the 1920s to 30s old left, 60s to 70s new left, and the 80s to 90s post-political left. For the possibilities of emancipatory politics today, the Platypus Student Club at Boston College runs a weekly reading group on the history of the left that meets every Monday night at 7 p.m. in Stokes 394, so it's right after this. Weekly coffee breaks on Thursdays at 2 in the RAD, and intermittent public events on campus. If you'd like to be included on our emailing list or get involved in our activities, please write your name on the sign-up sheet, so it's right there. Also on the table, you can find recent editions of the Platypus Review, our monthly forum in print, that can be accessed online at platypus1917.org. You can also grab pamphlets explaining more about the organization and copies of an article written by Platypus member Chris Cutrone entitled Why Not Trump, which is sort of a provocative critique of establishment anti-Trumpism. So to get that out of the way. I'm going to put the polemic with libertarianism aside until the questions, and sort of dedicate these opening remarks to clarifying to the audience, for the most part, where Platypus stands relative to the Marxist tradition, so where we're arguing from. Hopefully with this in mind, some of what I expect will be unexpected or surprising arguments we'll be putting forward will make more sense. So first of all, Platypus is an intellectual, not a political organization, so we're not striving for political power and trying to win any immediate reforms or participating in activist movements. As such, we don't take positions on contemporary political topics. You won't hear us argue for the defense of any nations or against the election of any capitalist candidates. Of course, though, still we have opinions, so political position and opinion are really the same. This isn't just a preference to be intellectuals. We're still motivated by the task of realizing international and material socialism. So why not be political? Because political activity itself, in this historical moment, to be clear, can obfuscate what we think is necessary to recover original Marxism. That is, what Marxist thought meant to Marxists at their highest point. So this is our primary thesis, that there's a Marxist highest point. What is that? On our reading list, on our reading group syllabus, after Marx, we read the writings of Lenin, Luxemburg, and Trotsky. These thinkers were part of the Second International, so the first being the International Working Men's Association of Marx's time, which culminated, not that, but the Second International culminated in the Bolshevik Revolution of October 1917. So after Marx and Engels, Lenin, Luxemburg, and Trotsky preserved Marxist thought. This is the high point that we're trying to evoke. The Bolshevik Revolution was quickly followed by the failure of the 1918-19 German Revolution, and of course soon the rise of Stalin in the Soviet Union. So just to be clear, we don't see Stalin in the Soviet Union as the continuity of revolutionary Marxism. That's not the high point that we're aiming at. Fair enough, obviously, I guess, maybe. But we go even further in suggesting that the fallout of Stalinism penetrated even anti-Stalinist thought, this was sort of suggested in the opening blurb, but the 20th century after Stalin has been the accumulation of obstacles to accessing what Marxism once was. So attempts to reach back to Marx, take it like the Trotskyists in the 20th century, the New Left in the 60s, or even like 2016 social democracy, haven't been able to reach the emancipatory imagination of the Second International radicals, and instead have been mired in the sort of accumulated wreckage of the 20th century. So think about this when you'll probably hear us refer to Marxism in like the past tense, as like Marxism is a tradition gone by. So the thing I want to put forward is this is the high point that we're reaching at. It's a time period before Stalin, and I think that will sort of help to think about the Marxism that we're putting forward today.
And just because most of you can't read this banner, so the slogan of Platypus is, "The left is dead, long live the left." So Janus face, yes, but just speaking to this this idea of a regression that's occurred in the 20th century, and while Joaquin is right to highlight this kind of high point that we focus on with Marxism in the end of the 19th, early 20th century, we also, in the annual reading group, we read everything from Adam Smith to Rousseau, Kant, Hegel, so the long history of the left, including the ideas of Thomas Jefferson, the American revolutionaries, as part of the same tradition of the left, a word which came out of the French Revolution itself. So that's partly just to advertise the reading group to build off that. But I guess we can go into the questions. Thank you, Tom, for being our moderator, by the way.
Thank you. Alright, to begin, what is the true nature of freedom, and does the state protect or hinder it? What is the true nature of freedom, and does the state protect or hinder it?
Oh, yeah, because, I mean, if you want me to go first, I can go first again, but I thought you wanted to be fair.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so the first point I'd like to make on this question is that Marxism didn't posit a new or unique concept of freedom, different from the bourgeois concept of freedom. Like the radical Enlightenment humanists, it recognized that modern freedom stemmed from society and wasn't something that could be handed down from the state. And I think on this point we agree with our interlocutors. So like Adam Smith, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and others, it had a historical or dialectical view of freedom, which viewed freedom as the product of modern social relations of labor, rather than merely an idealist, kind of ahistorical notion. And according to this view, modern freedom is qualitatively different than the kind of narrow freedom that we normally think of when we think of, say, free will of an individual, whether negative or positive freedom, freedom to or from. There's still a kind of narrow colloquial meaning that most of us talk about, but rather this bourgeois social freedom, it understood freedom essentially as the freedom to become new and different than what one has been. And so in that sense, the freedom to change. And that's understood by all these thinkers in the tradition as a function of a dynamic process, really a dynamic progress of the social totality. And so it can't simply be viewed as a philosophical question of individual free will. And the creation of the modern individual is certainly a vital historical product of this process, but its source is ultimately the cooperative networks of exchange, production and exchange, that developed over hundreds of years, colloquially from, say, the Renaissance onward. And this gave rise to a vast network of interdependencies, so that each of us receives the necessities and conveniences of life, not from our own work, but from this vast network of cooperative production and exchange. So then, with the 19th century, you have the Industrial Revolution, which essentially develops a new crisis, and it manifests precisely as unfreedom and the violation of that bourgeois social freedom I just described. Secondly, historical Marxism was anti-state. It was against the state, and its goal was the creation of a society that was stateless and classless. The Marxist immanent dialectical concept was profoundly realist insofar as it recognized the modern state as stemming from historical necessity. In other words, it was an an essential expression of capitalism and of the class struggle, the class contradiction that had developed. It wasn't merely accidental. And by the state, Marx and Engels referred to the deep state, or what they called special bodies of armed men. So not kind of elected officials of the government, but really the structural, this kind of, permanent bureaucracy, highly militarized, penal, punitive state. And that's with a permanent standing army, a robust police force, none of which existed until the capitalist era. And the essential function of the state, according to Marxism, was to quell the class struggle and not allow it to actually fully manifest and play out and resolve. To do this, the state forcefully violates the bourgeois right and the social freedom of both the proletarians and the bourgeoisie, according to classical Marxist theory. So before this, early radical liberals like Adam Smith had reason to believe that the state was withering away of its own accord. So that's before the 19th century Industrial Revolution. But since then, libertarians and modern liberals are essentially guilty of being in denial of reality as it's manifested itself. Because if we look at the last 200 years, what we see is essentially the destruction of civil social autonomy. We see the growth of bloated, highly militarized states, and we also see the worst violence and wars in human history. So the problem with the libertarian anti-statism is it's kind of idealist. There's some, if you want to come in, there's some chairs you can grab from the next room.
Yeah, we're gonna do
Cool,
that. Yeah.
thanks. So the problem with this libertarian idealist anti-statism is it's ahistorical, and so it completely neglects this change that I've described briefly and the kind of character that it's taken in the last 200 years. But besides Marxism's realism, what made it dialectical was the recognition that this unfree statist society need not be the case into the future. In other words, things can change. And so the last point I want to make is the biggest difference between libertarianism and Marxism on this freedom question is really the historical pessimism and lowered horizons of libertarianism versus Marxism's optimistic belief in human progress. And so, in this sense, libertarianism actually shares with its enemy, welfare statist progressivism, a kind of nihilistic outlook on humanity's capacity to fundamentally change the world. And this is expressed at a kind of national policy level versus the kind of global vision of freedom that, say, Adam Smith saw and Marx continued to see. But essentially, both libertarians and progressives kind of shrug their shoulders and accept all sorts of atrocities, all sorts of manifest unfreedoms, whether it's the extreme poverty, unemployment, underemployment, overproduction, artificial scarcity, and just the overall alienation and anomie that characterizes the modern world. Whereas I would argue Adam Smith certainly wouldn't have accepted that, and neither would Marx have.
My turn? Okay. So yeah, I mean, I definitely have responses to that, but I guess we'll just say that to the rebuttal. So I'm just gonna read my answer. I guess I can sit down. I'm sitting now. As libertarians, we define freedom as the absence of coercion, and recognize the state, the state exists through force. Politicians lie, cheat, and serve their own interests with money that was stolen from society, and they know nothing about us, and that they try to represent themselves as the man of the people. And I think not just all of us in this room, but most people in this country and other countries think that politicians are two-faced and not trustworthy, and we would all agree that they're not people that we should have our money and lives depend upon them. So there's absolutely no reason why we should trust them with our lives and property when they clearly work against the interests of society. But this is just an expected outcome of coercive taxation. We should instead focus on our families, communities, and workplaces. In other words, we should trust and rely on the voluntary bonds we have built with our brothers and sisters in religion, culture, or ideology. Furthermore, freedom can also be seen as having a certain set of rights. And who else has mentioned this? These set of rights come in two forms: positive and negative rights. Positive rights are usually called human rights in modern politics, and they refer to having a right to food, water, education, healthcare, and other services. Now, there's a lot of vagueness surrounding positive rights. Who determines what services? Who determines what services anyone should get or society should get? Or how should such services be distributed? No matter what propaganda politicians promote, one cannot possibly answer these questions on objective grounds, because needs are subjective. The reality is that policies regarding welfare are arbitrarily put into law, and the political caste could care less if the poor were fed or housed. Could you please close the door if you can? So, the US government spent $1.6 trillion on welfare programs in 2023. And the poverty rate in the US has been about 11% for decades, which constitutes about 37 million people in 2023. The $1.6 trillion have been distributed equally among the bottom 11%, then each poor person would get welfare money that is equivalent to $40,000 a year. Keep in mind that poverty threshold is about $30,000. There would be virtually no poverty in the country. And obviously this is more of a pro-universal basic income argument. You can argue that it's not beneficial, but the evidence shows that a lot of the money goes to health insurances, administrative fees, and it doesn't actually end up working for the poor. So, but of course those welfare programs are not there to help the poor, but to fill the pockets of the bureaucrats and their cronies. The welfare system in the US is nothing more than corporate statism dressed up as compassion. Government funds it, corporate cronies run it, and the needy suffer. Not to mention that all of this welfare money is stolen money because its collection involves the threat of violence, which is taxation. I'd also like to debunk the idea that society is incapable of taking care of itself without an authority watching over them, especially in regards to welfare. The mutual societies in the US are a prime example of the fact that it is people that care about the poor, not politicians. Mutual aid societies, also called fraternal organizations, were private associations where members paid dues and received benefits during hardship. Unlike government welfare, mutual aid was based on reciprocity, with members contributing while also having access to support when needed. These societies were especially popular among the poor and immigrants. By the 1920s, 1 in 3 men in America was a part of mutual aid society. And these organizations provided life insurance, healthcare access, unemployment support, orphanages, and hospitals. These mutual societies also provided better services for a cheaper price compared to their private competitors. Why do these societies barely exist now? Obviously, it is because of the government. The American Medical Association, AMA, pushed for strict licensing, reducing the number of medical schools by 51%, and making healthcare more expensive. Many doctors were banned from offering affordable lodge-based care, making it unsustainable. You can learn more about mutual aid societies from David T. Beater's book titled From Mutual Aid to Welfare State, Fraternal Societies and Social Services. I'd also like to briefly talk about the central bank. The so-called failures of capitalism that socialists like to bring up are actually the failures of Keynesian economics, which believes in the absurdity that the government having a monopoly over money and printing that money somehow benefits the society. I'll leave the details of this topic to my friend Jacob, who is well versed in Austrian economics. All in all, the idea that positive rights are real and government is necessary is a scam. However, the final nail in the coffin of the welfare state is negative rights. Negative rights are essentially the right to not be harmed. When someone says they're entitled to free education and free healthcare, that entails violation of negative rights, namely property rights. Nobody has the right to force a teacher or steal someone else's money to pay a teacher to give them their so-called right to get education. One must realize that goods and services come from people who own them. A teacher or a doctor owns his energy and the citizens own their money. Therefore, positive rights are essentially a right to steal and enslave, which is not acceptable. Negative rights, on the other hand, are universal and objective. Everybody is entitled to their property, thus nobody is entitled to someone else's property. So the answer to the question, the true nature of freedom is negative rights, and the state hinders it by implementing positive rights, or not even that. That's it.
So I guess we're trying to do like 3 minutes or so for rebuttals to
Yeah.
the question. If you all have anything you wanted to start with, take it away. I mean, we agree with a lot of this. Not all of it. We agree with the idea that the welfare state isn't a solution. It is at best some kind of band-aid, but at worst, I think more fundamentally, it's an expression of unfreedom, and I think we would diagnose differently a deeper societal problem that historical Marxism has used the term capitalism to capture. And I didn't mention this, but historical Marxism was also anti-tax. vehemently against taxes, especially kind of indirect consumer taxes that were used to prop up the militarized state, especially in the imperialist era of the late 19th century. So that's all well and good, but then this language of positive and negative rights, I think it sort of starts to have a very narrow view of this broader phenomenon that we're talking about. And so when you're talking about positive rights, I don't think historical Marxism was there to uphold that form of right against what you're describing as negative rights. Where you're describing, you're wanting to say negative rights are consummate with property rights. And I would just say, that doesn't actually give fair credence to what these early Enlightenment humanists were thinking. It's certainly not Adam Smith or John Locke. They had a much more profound conception, again, as I was laying out, of social freedom. And this goes to your point about social contract theory being bunk.
Right.
I mean, you described it as, well, it's clearly untrue because we don't voluntarily decide to be in society. Well, no shit. The word people use is tacit, right? These social contract theorists, and of course there's a broad literature, so, Hobbes isn't going to agree exactly with Locke. Like there's a difference, and Rousseau is going to have a different kind of emphasis. But the idea that they're describing is, they're not. First of all, they're not simply like prescribing, and they're not simply describing. They're doing both, but they're trying to account for a historical change that's happening. And in that historical change, it's that there's this new cooperative society of interdependencies. So the clothes we're wearing, the water we're drinking, we didn't have to go to the well and do all that. We're relying on society. We're tacitly bought into society. That's the contract. So the state question is actually somewhat separate and secondary to that question. But you can't just eliminate social contract theory and say, oh, well, because they posit positive rights or something, or sort of voluntarily. So that's all to say, this more profound idea of social cooperation is the basis for both radical liberal thought and Marxism.
Okay, so to address your point on social cooperation and social contract first, the social contract theory that I was referring to is the idea that citizens are governed by a government that they consent to. That specific idea. So the theory in general, the one that's implicating the division of labor and social cooperation, as libertarians we cherish that. We want that. So we don't really have any arguments against the division of labor. We don't really have any arguments against society cooperating. That's the whole reason why I'm an anarchist myself, because we don't need the state. And what I add on to it is, private property rights have to be observed in such a society, and force is wrong, no matter if it's historical or ahistorical. I mean, a couple centuries back, it's kind of ahistorical to suggest that we should abolish slavery. Doesn't mean it's the wrong thing to do. It doesn't matter if something ideal hasn't happened in the past. We're saying it should happen in the future, and it certainly has happened, either through accident or through some revolutionary movement. Some anarcho-capitalist scholars, talk about medieval Iceland, the Wild West. I'm not too familiar with what they have done specifically, but I'm just saying that it's the right thing to do to follow the non-aggression principle, and that implies anarchy and private property, is my argument. So you also touched on unemployment and poverty and capitalism. And we're aware of those crises, and those are exactly our talking points to argue against Keynesian economics, which argues for state intervention in economy through central bank, through printing money and other things. Adam Smith, Locke, sure, these intellectuals have definitely contributed a lot to society, to political intellectual thought, but consider our arguments as just coming from us and not necessarily trying to espouse a certain thinker. Well, in the conclusion section, I will espouse a thinker, Hans Hermann Hoppe, so you can talk about him. But the Libertarian Club here is not necessarily the libertarians that you might think of. That's more popular. We feel very close to Mises Institute, the Austrian economic side, rather than Chicago School or classical liberals. Of course, there are the sort of forefathers of the Austrian economic school people too, but we're not necessarily like saying, oh, they're just the right people. So yeah, we just want to like argue about ideas. Like, I'm sure you wouldn't think that forcing is bad, but do you think do you think that NAP is wrong, or the fact that NAP is an objective universal law is wrong? Like, do you think that's the case?
Yeah, I want to get into that, but for the sake of trying to stick to the format,
Sure.
maybe we'll move on to
Okay.
the
Yeah.
second question.
So we can start now.
The second question is a free market economy the best social arrangement for advancing freedom? Why or why not?
So of course my answer is yes, but to kind of get into arguing for that, I first want to define what we're even advocating for when we're talking about a free market. We define the free market as a society based on private property rights. It's nothing more and it's nothing less. It has nothing to do with granting special privileges to a so-called capitalist class. It has nothing to do with promoting greed or materialist consumption culture. And it has nothing to do with a particular structure of production, whether it's an agriculture-based economy or a factory-based economy or a guild structure. It's purely is a philosophy and the legal framework of property rights upheld. So within, you can go. So by that definition, freedom to us, and again with our conception of freedom, the free market just is by definition the most free society. But granted, that's kind of just semantics. So I do want to get into why I think there's an inherent component in the free market in private property rights that allows for a stable, well-functioning society and actually serves as the groundwork for a well-functioning society. And that's mainly the productivity of the division of labor. So in economics 101, we have this concept that whenever individuals are specializing in what they're relatively more productive at, and then exchange their output with other people who are likewise specializing in what they're relatively best at, that allows everyone to be far more productive, have far more output, reduce the pains of scarcity as much as we can. And that's what the ability to work together, because it's more productive, it's rationally more productive, that gives us a mutual benefit to working together. And it makes us not have to see each other as competitors for the scarce resources. We're able to cooperate and have mutual benefit from it. And it gives us a productive interdependence, which serves as this social framework. You can actually use a lot of the same language.
It's from Adam Smith, book 1, yeah.
Yeah, moral sentiments as well. Yeah, that's the kind of society that we're talking about. And it also inherently reduces the incentives to violence and expropriation of each other, because we can view each other as being productive even for our own sake. So it's not only this productivity of the division of labor necessarily stems from private property rights, and then also the pricing system that's inherent in being able to exchange goods. Being able to freely exchange the property that you own with other people and their property that they own creates this price system, and with this price system we're able to coordinate who produces what. It creates the extensiveness of the division of labor and allows us to actually compare the inputs of production and where it's best used to satisfy consumers' demands. And this is, again, the price system that allows us to cooperate. Without this freedom, without the private property inherent in this free market economy, there is no means of socially coordinating our productive activity and then our consumption activity. And even freedom in a different sense of freedom from scarcity or freedom from hardship is also best upheld in our system, I think, as well, because scarcity isn't an atrocity. It's not something that happens to you. It's the starting point of humanity, and the way that we reduce the pain of scarcity is by becoming more productive through division of labor, allocating inputs towards their most productive uses, savings and capital accumulation. That's how you reduce the atrocity of scarcity. And again, this whole system is all about social cooperation. So we can live in peace and thrive together because the productivity of the division of labor is more productive. and is more appealing than constant warfare with each other. And this productive interdependence then enables the luxuries of culture, empathy, love, and other beneficial features of society, but at first rests on the groundwork of the division of labor and social cooperation and a rational reason for social cooperation.
Do you have more time?
I'm good.
That's probably more than
Oh, please. I just want to.
sorry.
Never mind. We'll talk about it then. Okay. Our interlocutors conflate the terms capitalism and free market. They understand them to refer to the same phenomenon, but with just negative or positive connotation. But capitalism and the free market refer to different historical phenomena. The free market, or bourgeois society, was an emancipatory social development that emerged from the hierarchical feudal society of Europe over the course of multiple centuries, which created a new society based on the exchange of free labor. And it was indeed the best social organization for furthering human freedom that the world had seen up until that point. I don't want to repeat Will too much on freedom and bourgeois society. You guys already heard about that. But I just want to reemphasize again that Adam Smith and the other bourgeois radicals understood freedom historically as a product of modern social relations of labor. No longer was man dominated by nature, no longer is man dominated by nature. Man freely and consciously produces the world. It's going to be a long quote, but it's important. Marx wrote in the Grundrisse, what is wealth, if not the universality of needs, capacities, enjoyments, productive powers, etc., of individuals produced in universal exchange? What, if not the full development of human control over the forces of nature, those of his own nature as well as the so-called nature? What, if not the absolute elaboration of his creative dispositions, without any preconditions other than the antecedent historical evolution which makes the totality of this evolution, i.e. the evolution of all human powers as such, unmeasured by any previously established yardstick, an end in itself? What is this, if not a situation where man does not reproduce in any determined form, but produces his totality, where he does not seek to remain something formed by the past, but is in the absolute movement of becoming? Marx held on to this radical bourgeois understanding of wealth, which capitalism, the crisis and self-contradiction of bourgeois society, had made obscure, and which even modern conservatives, in their attempt to justify the present, have also given up. Capitalism developed in the 19th century as a function of the Industrial Revolution, which outstripped and undermined labor as a source of social value by introducing automation, machines, and other forms of fixed capital that alienated value from labor and concentrated it in the hands of capital, which had a new interest in accumulating surplus value for its own sake, rather than as part of a mutually beneficial division of labor as described in Adam Smith's time. The etymology evidences this historical distinction, as the word capitalism did not develop until the 19th century, when it began being used as a term to describe the crisis of unemployment, economic recession, monopoly, etc., which predates Keynesianism, none of which had manifested in Smith's time in the previous century. Marxism elaborated on this negative meaning of capitalism, understood not as a positive thing, but as the self-destruction of the free society that it had developed hitherto. If we treat these as mere terminological differences, we are still left with the historical material reality that such a society has not existed unencumbered, such a society being the free market bourgeois society, has not existed unencumbered by its opposites, monopoly, command economies, price setting, for 2 centuries. The way forward is not to ignore the historic developments of the last 2 centuries, or to take refuge in idealist abstractions. The alternative that Marxism proposes is not a utopian concoction, but the historical realization of the free market, or the promise of bourgeois society. Indeed, Marxism understood that only in capitalism did the potential for and necessity of socialism emerge. The development of the productive forces in capital creates, for the first time in history, the possibility of the abolition of the necessity of the direct labor of the many, as a condition of surplus production. Basically, for the first time in history, we're so productive that we don't need the majority of people to be working the majority of the time just to be able to overcome scarcity and to have surplus production. In Adam Smith's time, it was a division of labor that's socialized labor and freed men from spending the majority of their time in supplying their material wants. Today, the progress of automation has created the material basis for the emancipation of man from labor. Yet, under social relations of production based on wage labor, automation, which makes labor cheaper, appears as the enemy of the laborer. In imperialism, Lenin saw the same dialectical relationship in the development of monopolies, which significantly increased the socialization of production, but which remained in the yoke of private property. the forces of production are held back by the relations of production, or as Marx put it in the manifesto, the conditions of bourgeois society are too narrow to comprise the wealth created by them. As the great socialist Eugene Debs wrote, the abolition of the capitalist system does not merely mean the emancipation of the working class, but of all society. Cooperative industry carried forward in the interests of all the people, that is, the foundation of the new social order, economic freedom for every human being on earth, no man compelled to depend on the arbitrary will of another for the right or opportunity to create enough to supply his material wants. There will still be competition among men, but it will not be for bread. It will be to excel in good works. Every man will work for the society in which he lives, and society will work in the interests of those who compose it.
Okay, so in my rebuttal, I guess I want to start with just pointing out there's some just kind of semantics with you kind of coming from the idea that feudalism was the free market before labor was exploited, and then capitalism was just this historical fact when this new machine was invented and started to be able to exploit surplus labor. I don't care too much if you want to call it capitalism versus free market. Our view, again, is idealistic, sure, but because we're putting a definition to it and we have the moral principles to advocate for this ideal. So that's why we call it a free market. You can call it capitalism as well, but you have kind of a different conception of that. But for, I guess, there's a lot of like different things I want to talk about. I don't have time for it, but surplus labor being extracted, I don't think that has nothing to do with machines coming along suddenly and just machines coming from the ether. Machines are developed by minds of someone. They're developed by savings and then creating the capital goods in order to improve productivity. I think you're kind of giving a connotation as well that we had plentifulness before the Industrial Revolution, and then when that came along, it was a sudden drop in our productivity. Granted, yes, there was hardship during the Industrial Revolution because scarcity did exist. Scarcity also existed in the feudal, before the so-called capitalist historical period as well. There was hardship in that too. There was an expansion of productivity that allowed having to work less even before the Industrial Revolution. That was the Agricultural Revolution with the invention of the plow. You needed the invention of the plow in order to create the productivity to then allow us to invent the machines that allowed the Industrial Revolution. And going through that period, again, there was hardship, but that's scarcity. It's in the long run making us more productive. And we are here now, 200 years. We also agree there's a lot to lament from the past 200 years, a lot of atrocities, but there's also a lot to appreciate from the insane increase in the standards of living that we have. You can argue we have a culture that's not appreciative of that, and we have inflated behavioral expectations of a standard of living or something. But that's kind of a side issue of culture, I guess. I think that's probably more than 3 minutes, and yeah.
30 seconds.
Yeah,
30 seconds.
I can't think of what else to say, so.
Good. I mean, can I add
Yeah,
something?
you guys can add.
I mean, I feel like the use, the scarcity term that you guys, the way that you guys use it is kind of wrong, because scarcity always exists. Like everything is limited, everything is scarce, and our point is you start from there and you derive property, and then you derive an economic system, and which ends up being capitalism. So I hope that we're not trying to expose, we're not trying to support a certain scholar or a certain how do I put this, certain set of economists in the Industrial Revolution era. We're making our arguments ourselves here, and we are saying that private property is the right one, is the right property norm, and if there's any opposition to that, hopefully we'll get debate on that. So
I guess I just want to first clarify, I think maybe you misunderstood the feudalism part, that feudalism is there's not a free market society. The free market society emerges from feudalism, and that's the bourgeois era, that's the manufacturing era, the say 17th to 18th century, even though, but that there's there's bourgeois society where there is the emergence of this free market, not feudalism, and then it is that society which goes into crisis in capitalism, which only emerges during the Industrial Revolution. So that's the first thing that I want to clarify. I think that the issue of scarcity is overplayed. I think even the Robinson Crusoe example that you give with Crusoe and Friday, in the actual book Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe, the island is plentiful, and the arrival of Friday helps Robinson Crusoe build more things that he wasn't able to build through the division of labor. There is no singular stick. They have an island full of things that are just waiting to be made use of, and the division of labor and like the social cooperation only creates more plentifulness. And I think that especially now with the level of automation that we have, the level of everything that capitalism has given us, everything, the level of development of productive forces, it's just, the scarcity issue is not the issue that it was in feudalism. I don't know if you guys want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I'll add, I think another way to access this, in that like the eternalization of scarcity is probably, it's narrow, as in like capitalism itself has sort of overcome this. I think that this is key in the understanding of the price system as like the best way to coordinate production that we sort of reached at. But Emily mentions that in imperialism, with the emergence of monopolies, there's already in capitalism the emergence of the socialization of production. So in monopolies, it's not like the anarchy of the market, if you want to be uncharitable with it, but it's the conscious coordination of society of its own production already in capitalism. So capitalism itself has overcome the sort of narrow price-based or price-oriented organization of production, and presents the ability to overcome that, the possibility. But that's undermined itself by the relations of production. So and the potentials that monopoly has for us with like the ability to overcome scarcity is undermined in the phenomena, for example, of overproduction. As in the market and the social relations of production itself are too small, the prices are too narrow, the price system I should say, is too narrow to be able to handle the surplus of wealth, not like surplus value, the surplus of wealth that the monopoly form actually produces. So there's the monopoly in its emancipatory potential.
Usually a monopolist is said to underproduce, first of all, but also if there is overproduction that isn't being demanded, you should ask, why is that production being propped up? To us, we're arguing, yes, there is in our current relatively free market capitalist system, there are subversions of the price system and there is state control of things. We're arguing that that's inefficient and morally wrong. And we can point to that as a deviation from free market. But even in that case, I'm still happy to accept modern societies as relatively more free market, and compared to the relatively more socialistic societies that we've seen from the USSR, even the Lenin period, Mao, French Revolution. So even in kind of if the idealist system can't work, can't be observed to us right now, I'm still happy to compare the relative systems that we've seen.
We should move on for the sake of getting to Q&A and stuff, but just could I really briefly, as a broad conceptual way of, I think, framing the difference that's emerging, there's different forms of anti-capitalism. I think libertarianism is one form. And again, I'm defining capitalism, I'm trying to agree with what you're describing
Defining it in your own way, sure.
Okay, I'm defining you just use the term, the obstructions of the free market. Right, you said, there's this, deviation from property rights. These deviations from property rights, there's one way to respond to that is to say we should go back to, some earlier form of before that really developed and before the statist society that we've lived in for 200 years developed. Marxism has a dialectical response that says actually the deviations from the free market point towards a future beyond society based on labor. So I would say that's the future-oriented, kind of, as I described, optimistic, historically optimistic, utopian character of Marxism, vis-a-vis what I would describe as either just like a backward historically or kind of defeatist, nihilist perspective, put it uncharitably.
Could I briefly respond to the scarcity and plentifulness point? Because just because something is plentiful doesn't mean it's not scarce. We don't have infinite resources or infinite things available to us at all times. Like
But
if
Rousseau's island can change.
Sure, but it will never have infinite resources available to it at all times.
He doesn't have white monsters in Netflix.
That's true.
That's one
I
thing.
would
Give
want
them
those
100
things.
years and
The
they
second
would've
thing
made
is-
that, right?
The second thing is it's a very relevant point because it's a very fundamental point actually because we're not even talking about economics at this point. We're talking about the law, like who wins the conflict. So if I earn $100,000 a year and the government says, you know what, I'm just going to tax you 10% of that, and I want that $10,000 to be spent somewhere else in White Monsters and Netflixes, and the government says, no, I'm going to spend it in I don't know, some military operation in Iraq. Like that's a conflict, and the objective law says that since I earned that income, it belongs to me, so you don't get a say in what happens with my $10,000. So that's like the fundamental conflict that I'm talking about.
Right, but I would say that society, law stems from society, not the other way around. But we should
Law
move,
okay.
we should move on to the third.
Okay. How do you view the state of politics in the present? Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the shakeups of the geopolitical order in the last several years and the current trajectory of history?
So this is the last question, by the way, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So thanks to all, whoever's leaving. Do you want to maybe repeat that just because I don't know if people heard.
How do you view the state of politics in the present? Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the shakeups of the geopolitical order in the last several years and the current trajectory of history?
I'm gonna answer first. I'm gonna let people get seated before I really get into it. Okay. And can you close the door? Thank you. In addressing this question, I think it's important to distinguish between capitalist politics and leftist politics, or just left politics broadly. And I'll begin with capitalist politics, which is, I think, the argument I'm going to put forward. You don't really need Marxism to come to this argument, but I think you do need a clear understanding of reality. Contemporary capitalist politics can largely be understood as the crisis of neoliberalism. So neoliberalism as this period beginning in the 80s of like international capital, so like the IMF and the World Bank and like the process of market liberalization and like internationally, and the breakdown of the welfare state in comparison to like the prior Fordist period, so the Keynesian period that we've sort of come up against, which posited the nation as like the economic unit, and this is sort of characterized by the Keynesian state with state programs and its employment. Much in the same way as Fordism's crisis in 1973 led to the inauguration of neoliberalism via figures like Thatcher and Reagan in 78, or Thatcher 79 and Reagan in 1980. The economic crisis of the neoliberal period occurred in 2008 and found its belated political expression in the next decade with Syriza in Greece, but we'll probably know better, Corbyn and Brexit in the UK, and of course Trump, but also Bernie here in the US. So we're not in a moment characterized by dangerous reactionary movements, as I think a lot on the left would have it, but in a moment of capitalist change. Crisis, sure, but like change, I think, is the key point here. Now, to address the left politics sides of things, and I think it is important to make that distinguishment. Now we can ask, what does Marxism have to say about all of this? First and foremost, Marxists aren't the progressive wing of capitalist politics. In the skirmishes of capitalist politics between one bourgeois party and another, the Marxist position doesn't default on one side. It doesn't even necessarily tend towards one side or another. So there's not like more Marxist politicians. There's not like a consistent like left politician versus right politician. I think that many on the left has sort of delusionally linked their fate with that of the progressive, proper non-progressive wing of capitalist politics. Historical Marxism offers a different view of emancipatory politics than a pressure group or a tale of a social movement. So what must the left do? The left must keep pace with the changes in capitalism. In Lenin's words, one must always try to be as radical as reality itself. This means the left should not be the last defenders of neoliberalism,
the fiercest conservatives romantic for a bygone moment. Nevertheless, this is exactly what politics on the left looks like today in the attempt to preserve perhaps a welfare state or any sort of like machinations of past capitalism that we can sort of point to. The guide to Marxist adjudication of political struggles is really one question: how does this serve the struggle for socialism? And I think that sounds really foreign because this sounds really foreign today because of the lack of a political party. With a political party, politics becomes more than just taking sides, which the left has no influence on, so neither side. The left is sort of impotent today, doesn't influence politics, it just sort of like aligns itself with one side. A political party means actually doing politics, so it prepares the seizure of power, of political power by the proletariat. I want to emphasize this, like, this is kind of like the crux of it, which I think we're able to recover because Platypus echoes the Second International, historical Marxism, and the heights of the German SPD and the Bolshevik Party in this like key moment. In terms of optimism in this part of the question, I'm also going to demarcate this between capitalist politics and left politics. And in terms of both of these, I think that Marxism offers a kind of difficult but a profound optimism that you can't find anywhere else. Insofar as the present moment is a change in capitalist politics, capitalism continues to exist. Because of this, the potential for human freedom, that man can become his own master, still exists. So the possibility of socialism remains so long as capitalism does too. This is, I think, an optimistic vision. In that the left has failed to live up to what Marxism once was, I'm optimistic that the left can be what that was. It would be a deep pessimism to suggest the avenues of politics today are the cap on what politics can be. The memory of Marxism assures those attempting to be Marxist today that what exists is not all there must ever be.
Okay. Try to give a few brief notes. I don't have anything really prepared, and the notes I did, my printer ran out of ink to the scarcity point. But yeah, I just what I see is, at least when it comes to the question of are you optimistic or pessimistic? Generally, I would imagine this is a question talking about whether or not you think that the ideology that you tend to propose, whether Marxism or more libertarian thought, will turn out to be successful or be implemented in any way. In the short term, I'm quite pessimistic, but in the long term, I would hope that I have some optimism. And that's just something you see in current news, current developments. You see a lot of the rise of different more authoritarian states. They're taking more authoritarian actions, and you start to see more conflict around, which I think, again, we tend to think is a product of the state in and of itself, large-scale wars, stuff like that. So you have those problems that exist, but when it comes to the future and the long-term future, ultimately, I think you're going to see these states fail in whatever mission they're putting themselves forward, whether that's, say, a more, if you want to use the term communist state, but China, eventually they cannot sustain their kind of, I guess you call revolutionary mission forever. And if you take a state, more right-wing authoritarian state these days that are increasingly sliding to religion as the ethos of their politics, you're not going to be able to create the kingdom of heaven on earth, so that in and of itself will fail as well. And in the wake of these failures, I believe that an ideology more adjacent to libertarian thought will be able to flourish. So in the long term, I'm optimistic, but in the short term, I feel there's going to be a rocky road to get there. And that's all I have.
Okay. I think that one thing that we haven't really addressed in the way that we've been sort of asked to is the NAP, non-aggression principle, and I think the historicity of it, and like it's an kind of eternal idea, universal freedom, whereas we're sort of putting forward history. And I think that this is the right question to address that, because I'll say that the non-aggression principle, or the idea that we can have like liberating idea that the potential to apply like what is correct and what is like rationally arrived at as the right thing to do is not an expression of optimism but one of pessimism. It's the eternalization of what is concocted in the present moment. So this is to say that like the NAP or any sort of ideal comes from capitalism, comes from the degeneration of bourgeois society. It's not an objective ideal. I mean, it kind of takes that appearance, but it is a historical ideal. And it's a historical ideal that eternalizes a alienated society, sort of backwardness, whatever. On the other hand, I think Marxist historicism is the potential is optimistic contra like the ideal, because it recognizes the ability to break out of contemporary the existent, and to sort of realize that it doesn't pretend to posit a utopian idea, not because utopian ideas are bad, but because utopian ideas are the present. They are conservative. We sort of address this via Marx and his critique of like the utopian socialists, so like Robert Owen, etc. Marx isn't just like the best socialist, but he's the critique of the other socialists. So it wasn't just him that invented socialism, but it was like a big trend in the sort of moment of the crisis of capitalism in the mid-19th century that had a lot of utopian formulations of like what could the ideal society be other than what it is. And the point of Marxist historicity, the Hegelian dialectic, is to suggest that these utopias are kind of the preservation of the present. There's sort of that voice. They don't overcome it, but they represent the possibility that it can be overcome. They represent like a discontent in the present. So Marxist position, Marxist historicity, is a more profound optimism, and like these sort of like abstract ideas are stuck in the present. That's what I want to respond to.
Yeah, I guess since the rebuttal was mostly about NAP, I'm just going to respond to that.
Should we make this the closing remarks?
We can move this to the closing remarks. I think that's.
So we have time for Q&A?
Yeah.
Sure. I can do that, and I can squeeze in the historical class analysis with this. So the criticism that our ideas are utopic are, I think, unfounded, because our theories are strictly based on reality, that scarcity exists. Just because you can say, oh, there are plentiful resources on an island, there won't be any conflicts, that's just avoiding the conflict. The problem is that there is conflict. The government taxes, the government trespasses, other people trespass and steal from you. These conflicts exist, and these are fundamental questions to politics and economics. So you can't just avoid the conflict and say, oh, we should just live in a happy society, or something like that. And I also don't understand how it's pessimistic to say that you own the fruits of your labor, or you have self-ownership, which is NAP, or, harming others is bad. I don't think that's pessimistic. I think that's just a very sound legal claim. And history, I know you guys focus on history a lot, but history is basically just past events. It doesn't determine what's good inherently. And the legal good is determined by reason and argumentation. I previously noted that it's impossible to argue against NAP because the norms of an argumentation is that it's peaceful, and you cannot say that, oh, okay, I'm going to argue for aggression, I'm going to argue for stealing or initiating a conflict, because that would just be a performative contradiction. So hopefully we will have some points against argumentation ethics on that. Which is relevant to what I'm about to talk about right now. Pages, sorry. So, what we stand for is simple: harming others is wrong, and nobody is above this principle, including the state. We're confident that libertarian principles are better both ethically and consequentially. With the remainder of my time, I would like to talk about Marxist and libertarian historical class analysis. I'll be referring to the paper titled Marxist and Austrian Class Analysis, written by economist and philosopher Hans-Hermann Hoppe. Hoppe is a popular figure among libertarians, and he identifies as an anarcho-capitalist, so his views align with libertarianism. Hoppe carefully analyzes that Marxist principle, analyzes the Marxist principles and agrees that the history of mankind is the history of class struggles. The ruling class is defined by its incentive to uphold their exploitative position, and a revolutionary class consciousness emerges when the exploitative rule reaches its ultimate limit. Hoppe accepts all of these principles as justifiable, but, and this is a big one, he asserts that Marxism has done more than any other ideological system to discredit the validity of these principles by deriving them from a patently absurd theory of exploitation. It is clear to Hoppe and libertarians that there is no quarrel with the idea that pre-capitalist societies that involve serfdom and slavery are indeed exploitative. We also generally agree that most initial capitalist property is the result of plunder, enclosure and conquest, or other forms of violation of NAP. Hoppe claims that Marx is merely sidestepping the issue at hand by focusing on the horrors of dirty capitalism, which involves aggression, when his unique economic thesis states that even a clean capitalism, which does not involve aggression, is exploitative. According to Marx, the laborer is exploited because he produces more value than he's paid for, while the capitalist claims the surplus value as profit, hence the exploitation. What's wrong with this analysis? Hoppe correctly asserts that this analysis ignores the concept of time preference, the tendency to value present goods more than the future ones. Workers accept wages now because they prefer immediate consumption to waiting for the full return of their labor, while capitalists accept the risk and delay in consumption in anticipation of future returns. It is absurd to expect the capitalist to sacrifice his $100 now for a given time period, only to receive $100 in the future, since he can just hold on to the $100 without investing in machinery or labor. This exchange clearly benefits both parties, not to mention that both the employee and the employer voluntarily agree to this arrangement, and the employee is free to choose who to sell his labor to under clean capitalism. Exploitation then happens only when someone violates property rights. This leads to a clear class distinction between those who acquire wealth productively and those who seize it through coercion, most notably the state and its ruling class. The distinction between these classes lies in the fact that the ruling class cannot be boycotted like a business, because its income comes from non-contractual means. If they cannot be boycotted like businesses, then what kind of threat does the ruling class face? Indeed, only when the public awareness rises, what Marxists call class consciousness, can exploitation by the ruling class be resisted and potentially overthrown. This growing consciousness historically explains the collapse of feudal and absolutist systems and the rise of liberal and capitalist societies in the West, which spurred unprecedented prosperity. However, Hoppe argues that Marxism contributed to a regression by misidentifying the core exploitative relationship as labor versus capitalist rather than state versus producer. As a result, attention was diverted away from the real source of oppression, the state and its allies in finance and business. In addition, Hoppe disputes the Marxist claim that capitalism inherently leads to monopoly and imperialism. He contends that competition in clean market is not zero-sum, and capitalism fosters mutual gain. On the contrary, the real source of monopolization and centralization is the state, because it uses force. Historically, as expectations rise and state's ability to deliver economic progress declines, the public becomes more aware of the state scam, and they elect an anarcho-capitalism as president. In my opinion, Argentina's recent interest in libertarianism and Javier Milei's popularity is a good example of this libertarian class consciousness theory. In the About section of their website, Platypus BC says, the first task for the Marxian left is to recognize the reasons for the historical failure of Marxism and to clarify the necessity of a Marxian left for the present and future. If the left is to change the world, it must first transform itself. As libertarians, we would like to extend our hand to Platypus affiliated society by pointing out that Marxism historically failed because Marx was mistaken in his labor theory of value and exploitation theory, and that the real class struggle is between society and the state. If the left must transform itself due to its past catastrophic failures, we invite them to learn more about libertarian ideas that are based on sound theories. Thank you.
So, as our closing remarks, I guess to respond briefly to that, I mean, Marx didn't come up with the labor theory of value. Adam Smith and others actually articulated it much earlier. And more fundamentally, I would say that this crisis of labor exploitation, it certainly makes up a fair amount of what Marx is talking about in Das Kapital, but it's not the only, it's a major expression, but it's not the kind of only and fundamental conditions of what capitalism was conceptualized as for Marx, which is a broader self-contradictory society, or a society torn in two directions. And so at that level, it's actually manifests as like a crisis of investment, where there's essentially money that's sitting, capital that's sitting, that's uninvested, and so you have simultaneously the overwork of workers, the overproduction of labor, as Marx might frame that, and also mass unemployment. So various absurdities like robots and sweatshops coexisting. And so these are all like particular phenomenon, but they're expressions of this broader crisis that even say like Milton Friedman in monetary policy is actually addressing by using the state. And so the point is, the state is going to be used, the state is used, and this comes back to this fundamental question of idealist versus, say, realist or immanent approaches to the problem. And in that sense, I guess we're sort of both sides are trying to claim like some sort of realism and optimism or something. But fundamentally, the way that your side is presenting, private property rights are these things that should just be preserved, and we should just have a principle of non-aggression. How does that comment on the fact that society itself is not operating on those principles at all? And for hundreds of years, the reality has been aggression, war, state, power, police states, armies, etc. And so that's where, I'm trying to intervene with this idea that we have to recognize that change and actually see where that points towards. And the difference, again, with Marxism is it sees that change as an opportunity to actually move beyond merely a society based on labor, and a society based on a society in which labor fundamentally decides how and what we do with our lives. And that's where it wasn't about the proletariat dominating, it was about the proletariat abolishing itself and abolishing class per se. So just in closing, I want to thank our interlocutors for being civil, and this would have been a really different conversation if they were vulgar, and also if we were kind of some like Stalinist vulgar communists, or even if we were just like pro Bernie Sanders. I think there's like an interesting kind of profounder differences that we're just still trying to articulate between us, and maybe the Q&A can get that out further. But I think, as like Joaquin was saying earlier, I think this idea of Antonio Gramsci had a quotation: pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. And I think that best articulates the perspective that historical Marxism had on these issues. So
moving on to Q&A, or pose the first question?
Yeah, let's move on to Q&A. And you very much go for it.
All right.
Ask each other.
The moderator just wants to ask a question. Okay, yeah.
So, in my, understanding of both these groups, something that I feel like we could use just a little bit more of in this discussion here is more of a practical argument surrounding what we do with not just the economy, but also the relations that make up, the interactions between labor and capital. And I'm trying to, pose one right here that both sides could have their various disagreements on. In my conversations with Will, I've asked about the validity of worker cooperatives, and he has mentioned some critiques about them that I don't think we've fully prosecuted yet, and I can imagine you guys are opposed to them on principle too.
There's a nuance, because workers are obviously entitled to sell their labor however they want. They can form a collective and say, hey, here's our contract to the factory owner, and if the factory owner doesn't agree with the contract, then they can just refuse to work. So it's, if your understanding of unions is that, it's fine, because they own their labor, they can sell however they want.
Voluntary association.
Yeah, it's voluntary association, so.
Okay.
That would be my take.
Alright, well, regardless, I'd like to ask, in what ways are the idea of worker cooperatives as a basis for our socioeconomic structure incompatible with these respective groups' worldviews?
I can answer this from our side. So, as they mentioned, it's not necessarily incompatible if it's voluntary, as long as they're not stealing, they're not overtaking a warehouse that someone else already owns, and they go out and use unused land or something, or one of them just already owns a warehouse of their own and they decide to form a worker co-op and have a contract based on that. That's completely valid within our system. There are some economic reasons why it will kind of lead to stagnation and be less productive over time, because if the workers aren't able to sell the stock of their company, then they're forced to save in order to actually buy the machines and the other inputs of production. So again, I think Paul had mentioned before, workers tend to want to have income now and to consume now, whereas capitalists are the ones putting aside current consumption in order to save and invest. As long as workers are wanting to do that, it can work fine. There are examples of it working fine, but having a whole society based off that just wouldn't be very productive and would be kind of stagnant. But it's fine in our legal framework.
I mean, I'll say that Lenin said all power to the Soviets, so there's definitely like there's definitely an element where workers' co-ops or like the organizations of workers are essential, but I think that there is like the key difference, I guess, is to say that there must be a political character to like to make revolution happen. So workers' co-ops are good, and arguably there's a Marxist would like encourage the formation of like autonomous workers' organizations, but there's still essentially the need, like the necessity for a political idea to be, or political ideology or motivation to be sort of bestowed to the workers. Is sort of like the merger formula, the Bukowski merger formula. So the autonomous like workers co-ops are kind of restricted by their autonomism, and they still like necessitate the need for Marxist socialist idea and broader political motivation.
I guess I would also just say, there used to be a much more robust, as you were pointing to like the 1920s, I think.
For
there was, there used to be a much more robust kind of network of these mutual aid societies and certainly unions. And it's not a mistake that was also a period of these mass socialist parties. And so it's part of our historical thesis when we say the left is dead, and to trace this regression of the project of human emancipation, to put it grandiosely. In the 20th century, it's part and parcel of that regression that we don't have these mutual aid societies. I mean, we don't even have, as Robert Putnam says, the basic civil social network of like the mid-20th century. And so it's constantly regressing. But then just real quickly to tack on, I also think that there's this ideal of non-aggression, and you counterposed it to might makes right.
Or class-based.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think that ignores the reality that part of the regression in capitalism is that we actually imminently do live in a society where might makes right. And that private property is, the way that Marx understood it is, the private property of the worker becomes counterposed to the private property of the owner. And so it's both of those they're both forms of private property, which before that antagonism existed, wasn't actually dictating the direction of history and wasn't actually taking away the freedom of both sides. But because it's manifest so thoroughly, it actually points to the need to go beyond a society of labor. So that's where I was trying to draw that Janus-faced difference of like pointing towards some future beyond labor versus kind of ignoring the crisis of labor itself, or the self-contradiction, as Marxism put it.
There's any, is that okay? I was gonna respond to that, but I was gonna respond to that later. Yeah. Oh, yeah, I guess.
Am I right?
Could I respond? Could I respond or?
Yeah, sure. And then,
Sure. So I'm responding first. So I mean, for the NAP being or not historical or not realistic. Again, it's based on theories that are realistic, that are real. Scarcity exists, and because there's no example of a society that is just so happy and peaceful, doesn't mean it's not the ideal that we should strive towards. And the reason why libertarians hate the state is because it violates the NAP, and the state is the biggest aggressor of all institutions, and I think we can all agree on that. So slavery was a norm back then too. I mean, that doesn't mean you couldn't have argued that back in those days, oh, you know, we should abolish the slavery, and some historian will come up to you saying, well, it's not realistic, it's not historical, there hasn't been a society that hasn't done slavery before. Maybe there have been, but it wasn't probably in their knowledge or in their libraries. So, yeah, I'm just saying that this is the ideal, this is the ethical, this is the legal thing, and whether it's like, whether the reality says, oh, it's the law of the jungle, if someone is stronger, it takes someone else's property, yeah, it can do that, but we're saying that that's wrong and we should oppose it. And the state is the biggest bully in town, so we should just do away with it.
Yeah, I guess it's just a question of how we oppose it. But.
Yeah. Sorry, what was your question?
Is it fine to ask a question to one side, or should I ask? Okay. I just want to like start off. I'm like super like not well read, so I'm probably like the dumbest person in the room. But I just want to clarify like the argument from like the Marxist side on NAP was kind of that it's like historically it hasn't really worked. It's kind of like the premise, or like it hasn't materialized historically. Like historically, like we've been very aggressive and so on.
I would just say we live in a society where private property has been and is constantly undermined.
Okay.
So it's just like we don't live in the NAP like private property free labor like society. Like the way that Marx and the Communist Manifesto responded to all the criticisms of like, oh, the anti-communists say that communism is going to it's going to destroy the family, it's going to take away private property. Marxism's imminent dialectical response is to say capitalism's already doing that.
Okay.
And so it's pointing to how there's already this crisis. And so that's where I was trying to say there's a kind of denial of reality and a kind of idealist wanting to go back to a past, whereas Marxism recognizes reality itself is already constipated and halfway moved on to the socialist future. So the Hegelian or dialectical idea is that socialism is the truth of capitalism. Okay. So there's no need for socialism until you actually have a crisis of capitalism. And so it actually is progressive, and capitalism is the most progressive, forward-looking society that's ever existed, but it's sort of like bound up with this unresolved crisis.
Okay, because like my question was like pertaining to like there's like a lot of evidence that like territoriality or like NAP was like the game theory optimal like evolutionary sort of behavior. Like for instance, if you give a kid a Lego set, he builds it like when he's like 6 months old, he or she is 6 months old, he'll value that Lego set more than like a random Lego set because like he or she built it. It's like the endowment effect. We also have like a lot of things in nature that kind of suggest like that are effects of this sort of game theory optimal behavior that suggests that NAP is like kind of evolutionary. It's something that's like intrinsic, not just historical. So I guess my question is like how does like your framework kind of respond to that? That it's like more than just like a historical thing, it's like something biological in humans. And
I don't think we're against non-aggression.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
We don't like aggression. I guess that would be our answer. Like, who's for aggression? But we just have to be realistic. Like, do we live in a non-aggressive society? I think both sides agree that we don't.
We don't. That's
extremely
the problem.
aggressive society.
Yes.
And there's millions of Americans in prison. Like, the freest country in the world. Like, no, it's an extremely aggressive reality. So yeah, non-aggression, sure, but you know, how does that address reality?
Well, it addressed.
Yeah, I kind of want to say there's been a lot of this kind of conversation coming up. You mentioned before that libertarians are nihilists and accept the unfreedoms and atrocities, which first of all I find kind of weird because all my friends find me super annoying because I'm constantly trying to explain what the atrocities are and why it's an issue. And we're coming. You've actually criticized us for coming from an idealistic moral framework of this, as opposed to your just purely historical, objective, historically developed framework of things. And I think we're not framing things as we need to go back in time to how things used to be. How things used to be also had issues. We're also wanting to go forward and not only economic progress with productivity, but also go forward by changing culture. So I think your approach is kind of, we recognize the realities of conflict right now and let it happen so that the class struggle contradicts itself and destroys itself, and then we can go into socialist paradise. That seems to be what I'm getting from you. Our approach is, we're recognizing the reality of conflict right now, and we're trying to change culture. We're trying to educate people and change their minds about going along with that culture, with the current conflicts. We're trying to get people to stop going along with the state and every conflict that it tries to get into. So we are trying to go forward by preventing people from going along with what is degrading our society. We view basically as trying to save our culture from accepting bad ideas, which we're arguing is socialist Keynesian ideas. Not Keynes. Interventionist, antithetical to private property rights.
But you are anti-Keynes.
Yes,
Oh, definitely.
yes.
Yeah.
I wanted to clarify that because, Keynes wasn't the start of all things that we hate. And yet Adam Smith was also a labor theorist. He was wrong about that.
And I guess for context here, we prefer, we think that subjective theory of value is superior to labor theory of value, which essentially means the value of things are assigned by the subjective party that values them. Like if you, in an exchange, both party values the other product more than what they have already. So that's why the exchange happens. In the case of laborer and the capitalist, obviously there's time preference, but you can also understand it in a way that one exchanges labor for money, and the laborer values his energy less than the money that he's going to get, so that's why he's doing the exchange. It has nothing to do with labor itself. It's just subjective valuation.
For the sake of interest,
Right.
I'm just not going to get into the 20th century metaphysical conversation of the labor theory of value, but I think we should move on.
Okay.
The chair recognizes the gentleman in the green.
So I have a question for each side. I think both sides used or described the other's definition of capitalism as narrow, and I think I understand the sort of Platypus point on that as being sort of that like this philosophy of history, right? Or that the stakes of talking about Adam Smith when you guys were saying we're speaking on our own behalf, we're not like relying on this Adam Smith, is that that when you say something like, oh, this is the ethical or this is the moral thing to do, that's ultimately resting on an idea of bourgeois right. So the stakes of like bringing that up historically are that for it to be moral means that you're invoking bourgeois right, private property, right? And like the Marxist understanding of private property was that labor was the first private property, right? So in that sense, the system of private property, it actually works against the private property of the laborer because they're subject to a state of chronic unemployment and not able to sell their labor, right? And not able to realize their property in that sense. So I guess my clarification would be like, you said in describing the Platypus understanding of capitalism as narrow, what do you mean by that? And then my question, and then my question for Platypus is, you brought up your Marx, you brought up the Lenin, right? And Joaquin, I think you talked about, what would Marxists have to say about capitalist politics today. And when you brought that up to my mind, it was like, it was not clear to me that Marxists would have something to say about capitalist politics today, because it was like a critique of socialism, an imminent critique of socialism, right? So I guess my question for Platypus is, why even continue to reach for Marxism? What are the stakes of continuing to reach for Marxism when both sides seem to agree that it was historically defeated or amounted to some kind of failure, or didn't realize the ultimate Marxist vision as you're articulating it?
So who should answer? Again, I can go ahead. I don't think we said that their definition of capitalism is narrow. I think we just didn't really interpret their definition of capitalism, because what we defend is just NAPM property rights, and I don't necessarily drive that theory from historical analysis. I drive it from just reason and from the reality that there's scarcity and there's conflict over scarce resources. Therefore, there has to be conflict. There has to be a winner of a certain conflict. Therefore, private property. I just use reason and argumentation. I did not say, oh, Adam Smith, this and that. I don't know. Maybe Adam Smith was pro-NAP, anti-NAP. I don't really know. But my argument for NAP and property rights rests on reason and argumentation. It doesn't rest on something else.
This whole scarcity thing, I mean, you have this metaphysical idea of like the first state of man is scarcity, or like it's a starting point, as you said. I mean, again, I know we keep getting framed as we're being overly historical, but I guess another way to put it is societal, social. You know, we're born into a society. Like, there's all sorts of ways to put it. The point is, you know, we can't just talk about scarcity in the abstract. We have to recognize there's a clear difference between what scarcity meant for, like, especially say pre-Neolithic humanity versus, you know, humanity in like the modern world, the modern bourgeois capitalist world. And clearly what Marxism recognized was the kind of scarcity that develops in industrial capitalism is profoundly new and artificial. Artificial in the sense that it's socially created. It's a symptom of a social crisis, all different ways that it was framed in the 19th century. The social question, the word proletariat, let's take some old Roman word. Like, there was a recognition that all the kind of hope and optimism of the 18th century Enlightenment thinkers was suddenly like undermined by this new reality of actually people. You said like maybe there's always been poverty. Sure, but there's actually a new poverty that develops. There's a new kind of urban poverty that the word proletarianization tries to capture, that is actually people working way more than humans have ever. And we still work more than humans have worked in human history. Peasants worked like not that much. They mostly just had holidays and stuff. So we're spending most of our waking hours working. And so Marxism is partly posing that question of like, why are we slaves to labor? And why is there this new kind of class tendency of working so much to just have barely enough to get by, and sometimes not even having that? And of course, yeah, it's not what it was in the 19th century in terms of the most extreme kind of in-your-face versions of proletarianization, but the dynamic nonetheless exists. And so the question of like scarcity in the abstract, we need to talk like what scarcity, when, how, what. It's not just like some natural, you know, condition or something. It's a product of social relations.
So I'll give an economic understanding of what scarcity is. Scarcity is the limits of being able to achieve your goals relative to how many goals you have. So it's the limits of, you have a limited number of resources compared to the things that you demand to have and consume and use.
So create more resources. I think that's where we agree.
Yeah, well, you can't just have more resources. You must go out and acquire the resources, know how to use the resources, distribute the resources. All that is scarcity, and the most scarce item of all is time. You can't do all this at one and the same time. So there is an argument there's a new scarcity whenever people demand more things. If you want to only live vegetable living, then yeah, we can abolish scarcity because our demands are so low relative to the inputs. We can use all the inputs to get everything we need. But I think human progress and just naturally people do demand more things. In the Industrial Revolution, people could have ignored that completely. People didn't have to go work for the industrialists.
If they wanted to survive, they did. They were kicked off farms, so if they wanted to eat and not die, that wage work became a necessity.
To this day, there's still so much unused land. They can, in a proper legal framework, go to unutilized lands, and start their utopian socialist agriculture society there. The fact that the Industrial Revolution came about and the industry started manufacturing more goods because people demanded these more goods. The commercial society did start to arise and people wanted convenient stores and easy access to more widgets. If that demand weren't there, then that Industrial Revolution wouldn't happen. So the fact that consumers are wanting that, including the lowly consumers, shows that they're preferring that new poverty to the old poverty. To say that this is a new poverty compared to the old poverty and saying that it's worse, I think is your own value judgment when their actions are demonstrating that they prefer to work in this place and have a higher income and a better standard of living.
No, it's a lower standard of living, like by far.
I don't know how much you can statistically
I mean,
do
it's
that
you're
at
right,
that time.
not now, but it was like there was actually a popularization that occurred that was profoundly a
So,
lower standard.
how
Like
come-
England, Midlands,
Right.
like those.
But
But we
how-
don't have to get into. I feel like
I mean,
maybe we haven't addressed the actual question that.
I mean,
to address that point, I mean, as far as I know, life expectancy and the population grew significantly during the Industrial Revolution, and I don't understand how a poor person can get kicked out of the farm and impoverished and still somehow make more kids, and raise those kids and have those kids live longer. So, like statistically speaking, I feel like, I mean, I don't know. Maybe we don't have to get into the process, but in the legal sense, the scarcity argument that I'm proposing, it doesn't ignore history or different demands, and it's not metaphysical either. It's very physical. It's very real that there are scarce resources. That all the resources that are available to us are limited, and for that reason, because there are different purposes, different ends with those resources, there are conflicts. Thus, the Robinson Crusoe and Friday example. And you could have 10 sticks, you could have 1,000 sticks, and Robinson Crusoe might say, okay, I want to build a hut or like a palace for myself with 1,000 sticks or more. And Friday might say, okay, I'm just going to take one of those sticks to make a fire. That's a conflict. I mean, it doesn't matter how much of the sticks you have or how much plentiful the resources are. Still, it's limited because even if we had like materially infinite resources in this universe, let's assume the universe is infinite, they're not available to us at all times. Like you can have 1,000 sticks in some other galaxy, and there's one stick on the island, and since neither Crusoe or Friday can reach the other galaxy, there you go. You have a conflict in front of you because it doesn't matter if there are infinite resources in the universe itself. Time itself is scarce. So yeah, that's my argument for scarcity in the legal sense and anything.
You had a question back?
Yeah, so I know you guys were talking about how like capital kind of changed the way like labor worked and how like society kind of developed from like this free market to like capitalist proper. But I wonder how you think patent laws or IP protections affects or inhibits your like idealized society from happening. Like, are these people having access to these ideas and having those ideas and their access to them be protected by the government? Is this preventing these laborers from creating their own means? And then for the libertarian side, how would you address this and how would you think that innovation can still be protected, ideally without a state?
I mean, there's like, I guess to me, the question of patent laws fall under the broader category of monopolization, and I'd say that is like a key expression or symptom of, the destruction of free labor, the destruction of sort of functioning bourgeois society, unencumbered and free. And so, I think that was one of the reasons why the West became so pissed at the new Bolshevik regime and after 1917 was because one of the things that they did was basically try to eliminate the trade secrets, basically, right? Because there's this competition that a company wants to have the most effective, efficient way to create the most abundant, version of any product, but they don't want the other people to find out that. So it's like, to me, it's that kind of a question, or at least that's the political side of the question is, the socialist, utopian imagination is really like, well, we want to prevent this monopolization of resources and of intelligence and of ability. We want to actually open up, the ability for the flourishing of ideas and efficiencies. And so we need to actually eliminate trade secrets. And so I don't know if that's patent per se. I mean, intellectual property, it's like a particular question. That's at least how I would start to answer.
So, I mean, as far as NAP is concerned, ideas are not scarce. Just to say you're making a fire, and I see you making a fire, and I make fire myself. That doesn't prevent you from making a fire, or doing something else. Let's say you're coding or something, and I see your code on the internet and I copy, or you make a film. As long as I own the computer that I download the film on, or the code on, that doesn't prevent you from watching the movie or executing the code. Since property is derived from scarcity and conflict, you cannot say you own your idea. So for that reason, intellectual property does not exist. I mean, as far as how it can be implemented, I feel like you're more experienced in that.
I haven't kept up with this issue in a while. It's actually
Okay.
a little bit controversial even amongst libertarians. I think it's actually a pretty easy case to say that at least right now, patent law is way overextended. It's a huge reason that drugs are so expensive. But yeah, I generally agree with the moral theory here. And the implementation, I can say generally, companies do engage in R&D simply for finding efficient manufacturing methods which can't be patented, or ways where to put your worker on the factory floor. Like they invest resources into these minutiae details, even without patenting ability for it. My roommate is an operations consultant that does all this kind of thing. There's a whole world of basically doing R&D without needing monopoly on the idea. I think I would have to go into the data to convince you fully that we don't need any patent rights, but I think there are arguments out there.
I mean, you can also, like YouTube does, you can just prevent users from downloading the videos through code. I mean, it doesn't work, but you can come up with a way. You can come up with a way to say, okay, to access this content that is hosted on my server, on my computer, you have to go through these, authentication, payment, paywalls, whatever. So you can legitimately say, you can legitimately limit access to your property, and that also include things like ideas, codes, whatever recipe that you have. So, yeah.
And you can try to keep things secret. So you mentioned trade secret. We don't necessarily require open source kind of thing. You can keep things secret.
I think it's this broader question of like, monopoly is a primary symptom of capitalism for Marxism. So what we agree is this like authoritarian state over and above society is also a primary symptom of the problem of capitalism. But there's also ways in which, the crisis of labor, however it's phrased, it also manifests in these self-contradictions within the production and exchange process, and monopoly is one of them. And so it's sort of like, how do you respond to the reality of the massive monopolization of industries? Because I feel like you can't have your cake and eat it too. Like you have to either recognize that, like, yeah, monopoly, it prevents competition. Isn't competition the goal? Like there's a manifest kind of reality of monopoly that I'm curious, like, how you account for.
Well, we argue monopolies are effectively government-established privileges over a resource, over a company. So insofar as that's obviously not the free market. And how do we overcome that? We try to persuade, again, culture to stop going along with this power struggle, or going along with the state that keeps instituting these socialistic policies, this degradation of property rights. So we're trying to instill a culture that wants property rights, sees the benefits of it, and isn't misled by corrupt, powerful people into thinking that we need to monopolize this thing for your sake, or we need to have a minimum wage for your own sake. We're trying to, and a lot of our arguments tend to be utilitarian-ish, or we're arguing the economics of this policy won't achieve your own goals. And again, the policy of monopoly won't achieve the own goals of people trying to advance society. And likewise, we think the policy of socialism is also contradictory to the advancement of society.
I'm not talking, you're just redefining monopoly as government, and my whole point is, it's not historically manifested in reality. It's cornering a market and not allowing competition. And then how do you?
What is not allowing competition? Who's not?
And then what normally actually prevents that is you have to have these state measures, or you have to have some anti-monopolist league come in like from above. And I also don't think that's some long-term answer. But the point is, it is a reality. It is a kind of manifestation of a crisis that underlying crisis has to be confronted.
I think you're missing a lot of the history there. There's no time to go into it, but Murray Rothbard has a book on called The Progressive Era. Goes over example after example after example of for business
get another question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so for both sides, it seems to me like one thing the state does really well is kind of protecting itself and continuing itself. So in each of your respective like ideal societies, how do you guys defend from, you know, internal or external bad actors who want to consolidate power and reinstitute the state?
I mean, that's why we oppose the state. It's a centralized power, and it's a zero-sum game when there's a state. So obviously, a lot of ideological movements, a lot of religious movements will attempt to take control over the state, and the solution is not having a state. Having the most decentralized society ever probably is best. Like I think it was I don't know if it was Hoppe that said like we should have like 1,000 Liechtensteins in Europe instead of the European Union. But yeah, basically the solution is just opposing force and aggression fundamentally, and then realizing that essentially means opposing the state, including when the state regulates businesses for whatever reason.
You kind of got to it a little bit where you kind of mentioned, rejecting a lot of stuff. There is kind of, as we've a little bit alluded to, there is that cultural element to it, and there's a reason on some level that, you are told of the necessity of the state, and that's because it might not necessarily be true, but you need to believe it for the state to kind of continue itself. If everybody under the purview of the state stopped believing in the state's authority, on some level the state would have very little authority, and ultimately you would try to hope for that culture change of, well, no one would want the state to come around because we're no longer willing to believe that that's what's necessary, and that's how you would try to prevent the state from kind of either reforming itself or reforming itself.
I mean, I think I'll add that, we're also against the state, and there's some other things to add, but not a whole lot more. But one thing is that, like, internationalism, proletarian internationalism, the proletariat isn't just like a national category, but it's like an international category. So the vision of like a socialist future, however much you want to project that, but it is at least like a society without any states. So like external factors not